In England, for example, top government officials have acknowledged that we are being visited by craft from somewhere else and that there are people not from this planet. And what was really interesting, and I think should serve as a template for how to handle these things, was a little more than a year ago in Mexico, the defense minister actually handed over to the national media gun camera film from fighter interceptors that were using infrared, and although they didn't see anything, it picked up, I think, 6 or so UFOs, trailing them and moving around in an intelligently guided manner. Now, this is the type of openness, this is the type of let's share information with the public, let's find out what's going on, that is sadly lacking in the United States. But I think because of this increasing openness in other countries, we're now seeing this wall of censorship cracking apart in the United States. Just recently we had a major TV network special, and I found it absolutely amazing because Peter Jennings of ABC just very matter-of-factly told a national audience that the Robinson panel of the 50s and the Operation Blue Book, Project Blue Book of the 60s were not really scientific-based investigations. They were just public relations efforts to try to get people not to be thinking about UFOs. So in other words, all you folks out there who are old enough to have seen all the newspaper reports on the Robinson panel and hear what Blue Book said, it was just hogwash. Never mind. It's amazing, and but this seems to be the way. This is the way the status quo protects itself. They just can't allow information to come out overnight so people would be perturbed and actually demand that something be done about it. They stonewall it, deny it, lie about it for, 30, 40 years, and then finally just announce it as if it's fact, and everybody goes, yeah, okay, because they already knew this anyway. In fact, this network special, to my mind, reminded me of the old line about, hey, wait for me, I'm your leader. Okay? They did some pretty good jobs of detailing some of the major recent UFO things in the United States, the Phoenix flyover and the policemen chasing this thing through Missouri. But this was all years later. My immediate thought was, and they were interviewing the people involved, they were showing, reenactments and recreations of what had gone on, and it was pretty compelling. But why didn't they tell us that when it happened? Isn't that what the news media is supposed to be doing? And so it's really funny. But it's also sad, but it's also encouraging because this wall of science is cracking open. Now let me explain to you why this wall of science has been there. It's not that they really care that we know that aliens and ETs exist. What you have to understand is the United States government, the leader of the free world, is totally controlled by a wealthy oligarchy, a small handful of people that are just super rich. Most of them are not even in government, but they tell the government what to do. These are the people who are behind the UFO secrecy. They don't care if you know there's ETs out there. But if you know there's ETs out there, then you will know that there is alternative technology. And this could upset their monopolies over energy, fuel, transportation, communications, pharmaceuticals. And that's what they don't want. After all, who would continue to pay all these ever-increasing prices for gasoline that's polluting the air, choking us all, killing our kids? Why would we do that if we knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that there was non-polluting energy sources out there? This is what it's all about. It comes back to the old journalistic adage, follow the money. The study of UFOs, or ufology as they sometimes call it, I have watched with great interest how that has progressed over the years. Back in the 50s, the big question was, do they come from Mars or do they come from Venus? And by the 60s and 70s, we had gotten a little more sophisticated in our intellect and our thinking, and the question became, well, do they come from Alpha Centauri or Zeta Reticuli 4, you know? Well, and then now we're up to today, and we've got even more sophisticated, and now the question is, do they come from another planet, or do they come from another dimension? Or are they perhaps time travelers? Do they come from another time, okay? And in my study of all of this, I have kind of come to the conclusion that the answer is yes, all of the above. I think that there are various groups and individuals, species, who from time to time come and visit this planet, zoop around, and I think that to try to ascribe any one particular motive to them is tantamount to us looking up at the air at a Boeing 767 aircraft and saying, are those people good or bad? You know, you just can't ask that. It's a group of people, a group of intelligent beings. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But I will say this, I don't think there's any reason for great fear and anxiety, because the historical record is plain. This has been a phenomenon that's been around since our recorded history. The Vedas, the Hindu Vedas, which are among the oldest writings in the world, talk about the flying Brahmas and how that they were used to launch weapons and blow up cities and all this stuff. You know, again, we've got Ezekiel, and it just goes all the way back. So they've been here all along. If their game plan was like an Independence Day type invasion where they're going to blow up everything and eat everybody or whatever, it would have happened long before now. If their purpose was to invade the earth, it would have happened in 1947, when all we had to resist them would have been propeller-driven airplanes and machine guns. And now we have, you know, laser technology, scalar weapons, electromagnetic beam weapons, space platforms, and they still haven't done it. So I don't think there's any reason at all for a lot of fear and hysteria. So what is the agenda? What is the alien agenda, which was the title of my UFO book? I think that, well, let me put it this way. Back in the early 90s, they were clearing some rainforest in Brazil, and they came across the Caribo tribe, which was a Stone Age, still living in the Stone Age. Now, in years past, we were so sociologically primitive that we would have just rushed in there and said, here's some clothes, put them on, here's some Bibles, get religion, here's a gun, you know, you can hunt, and we would have essentially destroyed their culture. This time, we were a little bit more sociologically advanced. They actually quarantined the area, not to keep them in, but to keep others out. And then they formed a team of scientists, anthropologists and sociologists, and they had a pool, and they sent these scientists down there, and they conditioned this tribe to their presence. They let themselves be seen from a far distance up on a hillside or something, and they'd kind of wave to them, you know, and then after some days went by, they would get a little closer, and finally they'd be just across the clearing from them, and they'd hold their hands up and they'd wave, and they'd show that they were non-hostile, non-threatening, until finally they made contact with the tribe. And even at that point, what they wanted to do was study the tribe to find out what Stone Age societies lived like. And I think about the only thing, they did go so far as to give them some metal knives to make their life a little bit easier, you know. And you can imagine that these people went, wow, a steel knife, you know, this is magic, okay? The purpose of that story is that they were conditioned to accept this highly technological advanced race, which is us. I feel we have been undergoing a similar conditioning program since at least the 1940s to condition us to accept the reality of the extraterrestrial presence. And it's been quite successful. Polls in the United States in the 1950s showed virtually no one believed that there was any life outside the Earth. And yet today, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Peter Jennings said that their polls showed something like 85% now say, yes, I believe there is life outside this planet. So we are getting very close, I feel, to actually breaking this whole thing open and accepting the reality of life outside this planet. When I was a youngster in school, we were told the moon was just a dead world, just a rock, nothing there. And now we're being told, well, there is a little thin atmosphere and there's winds that blow across the moon, and oh yeah, we found water on the moon, and the same thing's happening with Mars. Oh, that was a dead world. Oh, well, we did find these polar caps. Yeah, it was probably frozen methane. No, now we find it's water. And now we find there's an underground lake on Mars that's got all, you know, and something tells me they've probably found some sort of primitive life. They just haven't announced it yet, but they will. And we're being slowly conditioned to understand that there is life outside this planet and that we probably live in a universe and a galaxy teeming with life. Now, so what is their purpose? They are conditioning us to understand this, because I feel like that, like in Star Trek, there is a prime directive. Now, I'm unclear on whether this is a law with enforcement capabilities or simply a general understanding, but it is a thought held by all of the thinking beings in the universe that it is not proper to interfere with God's natural evolution of a species. So they are prohibited, either self-control or by maybe some imposed law, from directly impacting on us and directly contacting us and giving us weapons, giving us technology that would interrupt our natural evolution. But yet I think, especially because of the onset of the whole UFO phenomena beginning about 1946-47, and that I don't think it's coincidence that that coincided with our development of nuclear weapons. And I think that out in the universe, they thought, they were horrified. They said, oh my God, the kids have found the matches. Well, they don't want us to destroy ourselves, and they don't want us to destroy this planet, and yet they're prohibited from directly intervening in our affairs and in our evolution. So I think that we've got crop circles and animal mutilations and abductions and sightings and increasing sightings and all like that, so that it's not directly impacting on us, and yet over this conditioning period we are coming to understand that we're not the only ones in the universe. And I think they're trying to kind of boost us up the evolutionary ladder so that we can grow to be full-class members of the intergalactic community instead of destroying ourselves through our petty bickering wars and nuclear holocaust. And that is the alien agenda. Recently, I completed a documentary on one of the most fascinating investigations that I've ever been involved in my years as a journalist. It involves an area east of the little town of Deer Lodge, Montana, known as Redgate. And this was named after a gate that at one point had been painted red but had mostly faded, but it was known as Redgate. This was the teenage parking spot. This is where you would take your date to go up in the mountains and park, and it already had a legend for being a spooky and creepy place. In fact, an urban legend grew up about it that the gate was red because somebody murdered his entire family and smeared their blood on the gate. Well, we went up to Deer Lodge. One of the first people I talked to was the sheriff, and he confirmed that there had been no murder up in this area. So the story of the murder and the blood on the gate was just an urban legend. But then he himself said, but he had had lots of reports of strange activity in this area, and that it mostly concerned UFOs. And then he gave us the names of some people in town, including the local baker, Louis Manacucci. And Louis and his family had lived up in this Redgate area, and they had some wild stories of seeing these ships that would rise up out off the mountain at night, of animal mutilations. His own dog had a huge piece taken off of his back And when they took him to the vet, they couldn't even sew it together because it was so wide. They wanted to know what happened to the rest of the hide. And this happened twice. So some neighbors had animal mutilations, and it was quite incredible. And so we began to dig into this little town, and we found that in this one small little American town of 3,000 people, within a week and a half, we'd gotten more than 30 signed releases from people who said they had had ongoing UFO experiences dating all the way back to 1950. Now that's amazing. And it prompted me to wonder how many other towns in America have had this similar situation, but nobody wants to talk about it. And again, because of the denial and ridicule factor. But the thing that I think was most fascinating about the investigation of Redgate, and that I think people should pay attention to, because I think this may give you the methodology for looking into these stories. If you have someone who says, I was abducted and they floated me through the window and I went up in a ship and they took me here and they probed me and they et cetera, that's interesting, but it's just a narrative. And your choice is, do you believe this person or do you not? And of course, this leads to the big controversy over the abductions, because some people say, well, I believe them. Others say, no, I don't believe them. You know, they're making it up or they were daydreaming or whatever. Well, we set about to try to find out what really happened. And there was a fellow named Bill Kelly. All he remembered consciously was that as a young teenager, he was with his brother and another guy. They were driving down a dark road late at night, and this light chased them. And I said, well, you know, what happened to it? He said, well, it just went away. All right, we subjected him to polygraph, the lie detector test. Everyone we had take the lie detector showed no signs of deception. So everybody was telling what at least they believed to be the truth. Bill Kelly, no exception. Then we sat him down, got his conscious recollection. Yeah, this light came and it was really strange and we were freaking out and it just went away. Then we put him under hypnosis and we get more details. We find out, no, it didn't just go away. It hovered over the car, they stopped the car. His friends were saying, don't get out, but he got out, okay? But then he got very emotional and he got very hesitant. And that's about all we could learn under the hypnosis. So then we turned to the CIA tested and Army used techniques of remote viewing. We had 8 remote viewers who took a look at this, and one of them pretty well typified what they found was, because they drew a car, they drew a big saucer-shaped object with a cone and these 3 guys rising up through the cone. They had been taken up on the ship, but they had their memories of this wiped. Okay, so that was one. I think the most miraculous thing, and I have to tell you this because it'll give you a good example of the power and the penetration investigative technique of remote viewing. One of the stories involved a young boy and his sister, and the young boy, who of course is now a middle-aged man, consciously remembers going outside of their ranch home near Deer Lodge into the woods and visiting their little gray friends. His sister did not remember this consciously, but under hypnosis, she too talked of going into the woods and visiting with their little gray friends. Polygraph showed no signs of deception, so we get to the remote viewing. The question was, what really happened to these kids in 1950? So that question was put to an administrator who then attached that question to a number, a 2 4-digit number, an 8-digit number that represented the question. What happened to these kids? He takes the number, just the number, and turns it over to a tasker. The tasker has no idea of what this is all about, what the question is, what the context is. He simply has the number, which he passes to a monitor. The monitor has no idea what the question is, what the topic is, what anything is about this. He only knows their target is this number. He then takes the number and passes it to 8 separate remote viewers who live in different cities and different states. This was all done by email and telephone. When they have the opportunity, they sit down and they do a remote viewing. All of them were trained and certified by some of the military trained remote viewers. They have a track record. We know these are good, tested remote viewers. They sit down and they look at the target. All they have is this number. That's their target. Go look at this. What's this? Okay. And they mentally focus and they go to the target, and all 8 then send their raw data back into the monitor, who sends it to the tasker, who summarizes things and sends it back to the administrator, and then we get our response back. Now, they all saw some different aspect of this, but it blew me away. All 8 essentially said these were 2 small children who went in the woods near their home and met with aliens. It's just astounding. I mean, even if that's some sort of a made-up thing, even if they're reading minds or something, you know, that's just as extraordinary as the fact that they're able to go and use a number to go to this particular event, and that 8 separate people agree on what happened in that event. So I'm hoping that this type of methodology to be used in investigations of this type will become, you know, a template for the use in the future to investigate such stories.
Biggest secret in the history of the human race, and particularly in the history of modern government. There's nothing that has been kept more tightly controlled and more secret. And the secrecy has invaded, like a cancer, many institutions, including the media, government, corporations. And this is a lot of things people don't understand. I mean, I have personally briefed members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, members of the Joint Staff, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, the head of the Ministry of Defense in Great Britain, our CIA director under Clinton. And what I found was that most of the people in government that you and I would normally think would know about these sort of clandestine issues were being lied to or kept out of the loop. And so that there's this rogue, very well-funded transnational group that's highly corporatized, privatized, that is running this. It is not, when people say the government's keeping this secret, I said the government knows very little. The government of we the people. There are a few people in the government who know, and those control points are lying to their colleagues. For example, there are a few people in Congress and Senate who know about this, but they do not tell their colleagues. And so it's a very dangerous project in the sense that it has subverted the U.S. Constitution, the British rule of law, if you go all over the world, the sort of highly organized group that is running projects related to UFOs, and they're quite developed, are operating outside the rule of law of any country. And that is dangerous because they're sitting on information and, more importantly, technologies. One of the things we found, for example, is that beginning in the 30s and 40s, and certainly by the 50s, we were studying the modus operandi. I'm quoting from a top secret Canadian document, the Wilbur Smith document from 1951, which I'm sure you've seen, has this statement that by that time there was a high-profile group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who headed up the Manhattan Project, to look into how these things were operating. And by the mid to late 50s, we had figured out the energy and propulsion systems behind so-called anti-gravity, extracting energy from the fabric of space so you don't have a fuel to carry. And that once they realized what this was and that it would be a threat to the big corporate kleptocracy that runs the world, big oil, fossil fuels, centralized utilities, centralized economies, that they put the lid on this and took it out of the supervision even of the U.S. President and most members of Congress and the British Prime Minister and et cetera and so on. Most high officials in the Pentagon know very little about this subject because I have been the person to brief them. And the ones who do know are part of this, I have a conspiracy of silence, for lack of a better word, to cooperate to keep this stuff very secret. The secrecy isn't because people are afraid that they're going to find out that there's life in the universe. It's because if it's confirmed that these UFOs are real, and they are, with it will become an immediate question by the scientific community, well, how are they operating? And when that gets asked, we have people who can answer it. And when that gets answered, it's the end of big oil, it's the end of coal, it's the end of centralized electric utilities, and it's the biggest change in the global macroeconomic order since the Industrial Revolution of the mid-1800s. That's what we're dealing with. The secrecy is clearly related to that, nothing else. It's all about power, and geopolitical power and centralized power. A lot of people don't realize there's about 250 integrated corporations and individuals in the world that control virtually all of the world economy. And they're all interrelated. They're vertically and horizontally integrated. And their interests in this are profound. I remember Lawrence Rockefeller when I was out at his ranch, and of course he had hosted President Clinton and his wife Hillary Clinton for a couple of years during their vacations in August during his presidency. And they were out there actually because we were doing briefings. I was putting together big briefing documents, and Lawrence Rockefeller was sort of a mediator, providing information to them. And you know, I was at his ranch out in the Tetons once, and he turned to me, he said, "Dr. Greer, you know, no aspect of life on Earth will be untouched by this information coming out. So vast and so profound are the implications." I said, "I know, Mr. Rockefeller, that's why it's been kept secret. It's not because it's a silly thing." Now, what the controllers, the disinformation controllers, want the public to believe is that it's about silly stuff like, oh, you know, an alien took me on board a spaceship and I have a baby floating in an incubator around Alpha Centauri, what I call the silly season of all this. And that disinformation is put out there through the UFO subculture, through the media, through documentary makers, through filmmakers who don't know the difference between information and disinformation. 90% of everything on this subject is disinformation, designed to do two things: either engender fear, because it's very frightening information which shuts people down, or to make it look silly and absurd so that serious scientists, policymakers, intellectuals, and academics will just dismiss it out of hand. And it's been done consistently since the 40s and 50s. And I have documents that prove that this is the case. I have a CIA document stating, this is in the 1950s, that this is a subject for the use of psychological warfare techniques and psyops. And that is true. And so it's something where the public, for the most part, is greatly disinformed deliberately. You know, not just misinformed, but disinformed. What the Disclosure Project is trying to do is, by referring to people who've had first-hand involvement with these projects, plus our own first-hand research, real-time research, is to put together the assessments of what's going on. And we feel this is important to share that with the President or members of the Senate Intelligence Committee as it is with the general public, because contrary to what the public would think on something this sensitive, Most people in government, even high officials in government, if they even know this could be true, if they make an inquiry about it, this happened to President Carter, it happened to President Clinton, it's happened to many high officials. They are basically told, we're not going to tell you. Sometimes they'll just be denied that it exists at all, but sometimes they will flat out say, we're not going to tell you. Give you an example. In the late 1990s, after I had briefed members of Congress on this problem, I was invited to do a stand-up briefing at the Pentagon for the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's called J2. And this admiral, I had provided, and in our book, Disclosure, which you can get at the website disclosureproject.org, we have a document that actually is from the 90s, early 90s, that lists code names and project names and code numbers that were authentic and legitimate as of that time dealing with this issue. I gave this to the Admiral's point of contact to us. He looked into it. He actually found one of those compartmented secret cells in the Pentagon. He called them and said, I want to be read into or briefed on this project. And they said, sir, you don't have a need to know. This is the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, we're not talking about some low-level munchkin out here. Now, what that means is that you have a complete decapitation of the constitutional leadership. And it also means that it's very important for us to try to identify intelligence sources who are courageous enough to come forward and speak the truth and put that information out to the public. Because I think nothing less than the future of planet Earth is hanging in the balance. And we're not talking just about whether or not people know there are UFOs. We're talking about what are we going to do about the fact that we're about to reach peak oil. What are we going to do with the fact that we have global warming and both polar ice caps are melting? What are we going to do about the fact that there is this increasing concentration of wealth in a few hands, but increasing poverty around the world that's engendering terrorism and hatred and conflict? All these are trend lines that can be corrected by this information and these technologies coming out. It's not just information, it's about the fact that there are seriously important technologies that would give us an entirely new sustainable civilization that are being kept secret because letting them out makes redundant and obsolete the $100 to $200 trillion oil and coal and fossil fuel piggy bank that these groups are sitting on. Well, the Disclosure Project is a worldwide effort to identify military and government and some corporate insiders who've had personal knowledge of extraterrestrial UFO or advanced propulsion related systems that have been kept secret for at least 50 or 60 years. The Disclosure Project is oriented towards putting together credible government documents and these witnesses so that there is an undeniable case made that this is real and not fictitious. It started really in early 1990s. And after I had briefed the President Clinton's first CIA director on this problem, it was made very clear to me that the executive branch of the U.S. government did not want to do this because, I'm quoting, the president was concerned he would end up like Jack Kennedy. I'm not kidding. That was said to me by President Clinton's closest friend. So what we decided to do was to take this on ourselves and initially put this information in the hands of members of Congress to see if they would hold open hearings, and when they chose not to, by '98, we decided to do this ourselves. And so the Disclosure Project was an outgrowth of our identifying the intelligence sources and the evidence, and then putting it through the system of government to give the government of we the people the opportunity to do the right thing and end all the illegal secrecy and bring this information out. Since they did not have the courage to do so in 2001, about 4 years ago, we decided to go ahead and do that ourselves. And since then, we have been putting this information out in the public domain. You know, our website's had over 10 million people on it. We have a Disclosure Project video that was the National Press Club event that's been seen by nearly 3 million people, which is quite a large number. And we just continue to put that information out through venues like this and speaking and what have you. We still would like to see the Congress take this on, but I think given the current governmental penchant for secrecy and supporting corporate illegal projects, it's unlikely that's going to happen. So I think it's really going to be in our laps. We, the people, are going to have to tell the truth. And so the Disclosure Project is a nonprofit effort to assemble the best possible witnesses and the best available evidence and put it out to the public and also to our leaders. We know people can see a lot of this at disclosureproject.org, which is our website, and we have over 450 military and intelligence witnesses. They range from generals and brigadier generals to air traffic controllers and strategic air command personnel in the Air Force to civilian people in the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, to astronauts and cosmonauts. And it's an enormous database of people who have up close and personally seen UFOs or worked in those projects in their capacity as a government or military person. And many of them, most of them, had top secret clearances, and some of them highly compartmented. And their information is really dispositive. We have enormous documentation that is corroborated by multiple people. For example, when I said, let's see what the Strategic Air Command and what the interest has been in these extraterrestrial vehicles for nuclear, seeing what we're doing with nuclear weapons. We decided not to identify one or two, but we have like a couple dozen of those people who were in Strategic Air Command, who were in nuclear facilities, who were in the old Atomic Energy Commission, like Colonel Diedrichson that we have as a witness, who had personal knowledge of the fact that even though there's clearly no evidence, I want to emphasize this, that these extraterrestrial civilizations are hostile towards us, I think they're very worried about our hostility. I always turn this on its head, because most of these sort of documentaries are always like alien invasion and all this stuff. No. The issue is that, you know, if they were hostile, we would know it by now. It's clear to me that what's going on is that they're very concerned that at the time that humanity reached the ability to go into space, early space exploration, 50s, we also had already developed weapons of mass destruction and thermonuclear and hydrogen bombs and stuff. And that the coincidence of that, the coming together of those two things, put a big red flag over Earth. And so if you look at the databases from the 50s, 60s, 70s on forward, not only in the United States, but in Great Britain, in the Soviet Union, in China, that wherever we had space, aerospace, and nuclear facilities, there were a lot of these so-called UFOs being seen. And it makes sense, because it's a very short distance from where we are now to being able to go further out into space with these kinds of aggressive tendencies. And one of the things I point out to people is that our social and spiritual development appears to have lagged behind our technological prowess, and our technological capacities are actually at this point a threat to perhaps the cosmic order, if you will. So we have really determined that these witnesses that have been in these projects have enormous insight into what's actually happened. And it's not only their testimony, but it also can put together a mosaic going all the way back to the 40s and 50s. We have, for example, a brigadier general who had worked as an aide to President Eisenhower, who saw how Eisenhower was very interested in all this, but was being left out of this decision-making process, that he'd lost control of these projects. That's as clear as I can explain it to people as to why the secrecy exists and why we have decided, I'm an emergency physician, I've left my position as a doctor to do this pro bono for free, because I feel it's so important that this information get out to the public and as quickly as possible. We have a term called FastWalkers that's been used from people who have been at NORAD, that have tracked these objects in near-Earth space. Actually, that term was used in the 60s and 70s. The National Security Agency actually for a long time had called these ETVs, extraterrestrial vehicles. The word UFO is actually a disinformation term that was invented after they knew that they weren't unidentified and they knew they didn't fly. So it's sort of a mind play. The fast walkers are these very rapid-moving electrogravitic and anti-gravity disks and craft of various shapes that are tracked on classified tracking systems, both in their deep space network and also in the atmosphere. We have more than one witness who have been involved in the tracking of these objects on radar. You know, many people say, well, look, if this stuff was real, why are there no radar reports? I said, we have them. We actually have the radar tapes from the FAA. So we have people from the FAA and from the military who have tracked these objects. And they've been called fast walkers because, as opposed to slow walkers, which are satellites, because they move at enormous speeds. For example, they've been tracked at going tens of thousands of miles per hour in the atmosphere and make a right-hand turn without decelerating. Well, you can't do that with a conventional system. You have to correct for gravity and mass inertia, and that's what these things are doing. So these have been tracked on dedicated and classified radar systems. Occasionally, people who are on an ordinary system will pick them up, although the modern radar systems are designed to filter those out. Well, the thing I would have people look at, if they really wanted to find out, I think they need to look at these firsthand top secret witnesses and what they've seen. I think that if you go to the civilians, it's a whole gamish of misinformation, disinformation, and amateur hour. What we've tried to do is professionalize the effort, and people really need to look. I mean, if somebody who had the clearance to carry nuclear weapons or launch nuclear weapons saw these objects over a nuclear facility and reported it and have documents to prove it happened, this is dispositive. That's what someone who is wanting to look into this, who says, well, could this really be true and I don't know about it, they need to look at that, and we've assembled it. We have a 600-page book of top secret documents and the transcripts of these witnesses. We have videotapes. We have a 4-hour tape. We have a 2-hour tape. We have a 1-hour tape. And our website, disclosureproject.org, actually has a lot of this information and the testimony on there. I think that's what people need to look at, and it's the weight of the evidence. But if you wanted to look at one case, for example, that would be dispositive, look at what the third highest ranking member of the FAA, John Callahan, brought to us. This man, during the Reagan years, was in charge of accidents and investigations for the FAA in the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration. He was called into a case, which is the Japan Airlines case over Alaska, where an extraterrestrial vehicle the size of a huge ship was being tracked on military radar, civilian radar, and onboard a 747's onboard radar for a prolonged period of time. This was given back to him. He did an analysis of the data. He determined that it was a real structured object moving at enormous and unusual velocities. In fact, it would be one point in the sky and then instantly would be in another place 40, 50 miles away. And this thing was the size, he said, of a destroyer, a battleship. Big, huge. It wasn't like 30 feet around. It was hundreds of feet. And this was seen by the pilot. We have the pilot's report. We have the original radar tapes and the digital reports, this thick of a report. He was called in to do a briefing for Ronald Reagan's science advisor, people from the CIA and FBI. At the end of that meeting, they turned to him and they said, you were not at this meeting, this event didn't happen, and we're confiscating all this stuff. Well, what they didn't know is that they confiscated duplicates. He kept the originals, and when he retired, he gave them to us. This man's name is John Callahan. We have his name, address, a phone number. We have all this evidence. That's one case. So, I mean, and it's dispositive. And the question is, if you have one case like that, it proves it. But we have hundreds of cases like that. So I would say to people, look at the evidence. The evidence is there. Now, the big question is, why doesn't the masses of people know about it? The only institution that is more corrupt than what I'm describing as this rogue transnational kleptocracy is the major media. Worse than the Congress, worse than the White House, worse than anything at the normal level of clearances at the Pentagon is big media. Big media does not report the truth about these things because they are not free to. And we think in the United States and in the Western world we really have a free press. We have a free press on everything that's not important. On the really important issues, it's very controlled. And this is the most important issue. This is the biggest secret in the history of the human race, the known modern history of government. And they have cooperated with keeping this secret. And that's why it's very important to use every venue we can to get the information out. Well, actually, there's been a lot of coverage of what we're doing in the media superficially. And let me give you an example. ABC News and other major networks were at the Disclosure Project National Press Club event about 4 years ago. The executive producer for ABC News told me they wanted to do a very big expose on this through Primetime Live or 2020. I said, we'll give you everything. So we gave him literally, you know, the sort of distilled 35 hours of digital videotape of these witnesses and all our documents so he could do this. And carte blanche access to all these top secret witnesses. He called me a couple weeks later and said, well, they won't let me do this. I said, who's they? He says, well, Dr. Greer, you know who they are. And so the people, the corporate bosses who answer to some of these transnational financial and other interests were basically killed the project. We've seen this happen over and over again. And so you can get a certain amount of information out through the large media, but it's very superficial, very brief. That's what we found. The in-depth sort of disclosure of what's really going on, who's behind it, what the agenda is, that is almost always stopped. Or if they try to do it, it gets turned into something ridiculous. Like what Peter Jennings did last year on ABC News. It was absurd. I mean, there have been better things done on inexpensive cable channels. So my point is that the media people, the rank and file, are often very interested. But then from somewhere deeper and higher than they are, it gets killed if they try to do anything in depth. So that's what we have found. And so the in-depth information, I think we have to put out through the internet, through other documentaries and through other means. Maybe eventually there will be a media interest that is large media that will do a true expose of this. We stand ready to work with anyone who's willing to do that, and we certainly have the evidence to do it. The central point I'd like to communicate to people is that we all have a responsibility to find out what the truth is about something like this. And it is, people have to take responsibility for looking into what the truth is. We've put together the means for people to do that. Now people have to take the initiative, and we need all the help we can get. I would ask people to help us network this to anyone and any institution that can help. The reason this is so critical is that we've reached a point in our civilization where for us to go forward as a people, we're going to have to end this kind of illegal secrecy, and we're going to have to allow this information and these technologies to get out and begin to fix many of these large problems. The question of UFOs and extraterrestrials, most people just think is something entertaining. In reality, it's something that is central to how we're going to be able to go forward as a civilization, because that issue involves sciences, technologies, energy and propulsion systems that could give us a whole new civilization. Imagine being able to run your house or your car or your business from an energy source that is non-polluting, doesn't connect to a central grid, does not use fossil fuels or nuclear power, and is extracting energy from what's called the space around us, the quantum vacuum space. That's what these technologies do. We, the taxpayers, have through our government and what's called the black budget, it's about $100 billion a year, put money that have gone into corporations like Lockheed, Northrop, SAIC, EG&G, Raytheon and E-Systems, okay, Atlantic Research Corporation, and those entities have these technologies. It's time for us to say we would like to have a dividend on that investment. And this information belongs to the people, the technologies belong to the people, and the Earth and all of humanity needs to have these technologies for peaceful energy generation.